There is a silence that weighs more than marble, a silence that spans centuries, inhabiting corridors where light hesitates before entering. In the underground of faith, where the sacred meets the forgotten, there are traces of a presence that has never been officially recognized, a monastic order that does not appear in any public record, whose members never delivered sermons before crowds, but whose hands touched the deepest secrets of Christendom. This is the story of the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood, the so-called shadow monks. The walls of the Vatican hold more than art and prayer. They retain echoes of oaths whispered in dead languages, of rituals performed while the world sleeps, of manuscripts that should never see the light of day. Official history speaks of popes, councils, and reforms. But there is another story, written in invisible ink, preserved by those who chose anonymity as their vocation. They sought neither earthly glory nor celestial recognition. Their mission was different: to guard what could not be revealed, to protect what could not be destroyed, to know what could not be shared. The first traces of this order appear in fragmented form in medieval documents, always in the subtext, always as an eloquent absence. Letters from cardinals mention the brothers who have no name. Archivists' diaries speak of monks who dwell where memory ends. Inventories of relics list objects guarded by invisible custodians. Each mention is brief, almost accidental, as if the very act of writing about them violated an ancestral pact of silence. However, when these fragments scattered throughout the centuries are brought together, an undeniable pattern emerges. The secret brotherhood of the Vatican existed, and perhaps still exists. What would lead men of faith to hide in the shadows of their own church? What kind of knowledge would require such a degree of secrecy? The answer lies in the nature of what they protected. It wasn't just administrative documents or diplomatic correspondence. It was texts that questioned dogmas, prophecies that contradicted the official narrative, accounts of events that the church needed to deny in order to survive. It was the Gospels that didn't make it into the canon, the visions of saints that spoke too much, the confessions of popes that revealed all too human doubts. The shadow monks were the guardians of what the official faith could not contain without falling apart. Within the labyrinthine structures of the Vatican, there are areas that don't appear on any tourist map. Corridors that end in doors without handles, staircases that descend beyond the level of the known catacombs, tiny chapels where only 3 people could fit on their knees. In these spaces forgotten by official architecture, the Brotherhood established its sanctuaries. There, far from the eyes of cardinals and even from official archivists, they performed their preservation rituals. They copied forbidden texts by the light of eternal candles, translated codes that no one else understood, cataloged artifacts that officially did not exist. They were monks, yes, but of an order that transcended conventional monastic rules. Recruitment for the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood never followed normal processes. There were no public novitiates or recorded ordination ceremonies. Those chosen were identified through mysterious criteria, perhaps by demonstrating an exceptional ability to keep secrets, perhaps by possessing rare linguistic knowledge, perhaps simply by an indefinable quality that marked them as worthy of bearing the weight of the occult. It is said that the invitation arrived enigmatically, a book left in a certain place, a discreet symbol drawn in the margin of a manuscript, a phrase whispered during confession. Whoever understood the call would go to a specific point in the Vatican at a certain hour of the night and cross the threshold between the known world and the realm of sacred shadows. If this mystery has touched you, stay until the end. There is something you need to hear. The shadow monks were not heretics. They did not conspire against the church. On the contrary, they believed they were serving the true essence of faith, protecting it from its own contradictions. They understood that the religious institution, to maintain its moral authority over millions of souls, needed to project absolute certainty. But truth is always more complex than doctrine, and someone needed to safeguard this complexity, preserve it for a future time. Perhaps a time when humanity would be ready to look at its own faith without fear of seeing it crumble. Do you feel that what has been forgotten still calls to us? In the archives that no one consults, in the shadows that no candle reaches, there are voices waiting to be heard again, and perhaps, just perhaps, the spiritual descendants of those monks still walk the same corridors, still guard the same secrets, still perform the same silent rituals of preservation. The Brotherhood may have changed form, but its essence, The vocation to protect the sacred through secrecy may be eternal. To understand the genesis of the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood, it is necessary to return to the first centuries of Christianity, when faith was still multifaceted and the canon had not yet solidified. In those times, multiple interpretations of Christian teachings coexisted in creative tension. There were the Gnostics who saw secret knowledge as a path to salvation. There were the Montanists who believed in continuous prophetic revelations. There were the Ebionites who maintained Jewish practices while recognizing Jesus as the Messiah. And there were dozens of other groups, each carrying its own version of revealed truth. When the institutional church began to consolidate, especially after its official recognition as the religion of the Roman Empire, it became necessary to establish orthodoxy. Texts were selected, others were prescribed. Practices were standardized, others were condemned as heretical. But those who made these decisions understood something fundamental. They were choosing, not discovering a single pre-existing truth. They were building unity through exclusion, and some of them, moved by historical awareness or intellectual respect for discarded traditions, could not simply destroy everything that was inconvenient. It was in this context that the seed of what would become the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood was sown. Groups of scribes, theologians, and monks initially tasked with identifying and eliminating heretical texts made a different decision. Instead of destroying, they preserved. Instead of annihilating the memory of defeated currents, they guarded their records. They created secret repositories where Gnostic gospels, apocryphal apocalypses, controversial theological treatises, and accounts of unauthorized mystical visions could survive. They did this not out of betrayal of the Church, but out of a deeper fidelity to the completeness of Christian witness. In the following centuries, this clandestine preservation function became discreetly institutionalized. During the Middle Ages, as the Vatican consolidated its temporal and spiritual power, the Brotherhood found its definitive place within the physical and hierarchical structures of the Holy See. They operated in the interstices, in unmapped spaces, in undeclared functions. Officially, they were copyists, archivists, auxiliary librarians. Unofficially, they were the guardians of a parallel library, a shadowy collection that mirrored and contradicted the official library. The knowledge they protected was dangerous not because it was evil, but because it was destabilizing. It included texts that showed disagreements among the early apostles, letters that revealed theological doubts of canonized figures, gospels that presented a more human or more enigmatic Jesus than the Christ of official creeds. It also included prophecies about the future of the Church that did not align with the triumphalist narrative, apocalyptic visions that suggested divine judgment on the ecclesiastical institution itself, and accounts of miracles that could not be validated without questioning other already official miracles. Each document was a potential threat to doctrinal coherence, and therefore needed to be kept silent, but not eliminated. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood developed its own initiation and preservation rituals. New members underwent ceremonies that bound them not only to the order, but to the very knowledge they would guard. They swore not to reveal, but also not to destroy. They promised not to teach, but also not to forget. They received training in ancient languages, cryptography, manuscript restoration techniques, and, crucially, in spiritual discernment, the ability to distinguish between heresy that threatened genuine faith and diversity that enriched the understanding of the divine. The locations where they operated were chosen with symbolic and practical intent. They preferred underground spaces, beneath the visible foundations of papal power. There, in the depths where ancient Rome still breathed beneath Christian Rome, they established their preservation chambers. They used natural ventilation systems to maintain the manuscripts, took advantage of the constant humidity of underground aquifers to prevent drying out, and built shelves in niches carved into the very volcanic rock upon which the Vatican stands. It was as if they were burying seeds of truth for an uncertain future spring. Each layer that is revealed brings another shadow. Keep watching. The veil has not yet been fully lifted. The relationship between the Brotherhood and the popes has varied throughout the centuries. Some pontiffs were completely unaware of its existence. Others vaguely knew of certain practices of document preservation outside of normal protocols. A few, those who had been serious theologians before ascending to the papacy, were fully aware of the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood and even consulted it during times of doctrinal crisis. These popes understood the value of having access, even if secret, to the full historical complexity of the faith, especially when they needed to make decisions that would affect millions of believers. There were times when the Brotherhood's existence was nearly revealed. During the Protestant Reformation, when Luther and other reformers attacked papal authority citing historical inconsistencies, there was pressure to open or destroy the secret archives. The Brotherhood resisted both options. In the Counter-Reformation, when the Church was defensively closing itself off, some members of the order were accused of heretical sympathies for possessing forbidden texts. They replied that they possessed nothing. They merely kept them safe in the name of a future church that would be strong enough to face its entire history without fear. The vocation of the shadow monks was paradoxical: to serve the Church through secrecy, to protect the faith through concealment, to honor the truth through silence. They were not liars, for they never uttered falsehoods. They were not traitors, for their loyalty was absolute. Rather, they were guardians of a different temporality. They worked not for the institutional present, but for a theological future that might never arrive, but which deserved to be possible. Traces of the Vatican's secret brotherhood emerge in unexpected places, always fragmentary, always enigmatic. In the 17th century, an inventory of a monastic library in Tuscany lists 14 volumes entrusted to the Mute brothers for perpetual safekeeping. No names are mentioned. No location is specified. Only the expression Mute Brothers, a title that appears repeatedly in documents from different eras, always associated with the transfer of sensitive texts. Modern scholars debate whether mute was literal or metaphorical. The Brotherhood preferred ambiguity. Perhaps both interpretations were true. Among the manuscripts that have survived on the margins of official history, there are some with peculiar markings: discrete symbols in the margins, sequences of dots that do not correspond to any known punctuation system, small drawings of keys, doors, or eyes that appear at specific moments in the text. Researchers initially attributed these marks to distracted copyists or conventional monastic codes. But when dozens of manuscripts from different origins present the same symbols in the same types of passages, always in theologically controversial or historically problematic sections, the pattern suggests coordinated intent. It suggests a network of preservers who communicated across generations using language invisible to official eyes. One of the most intriguing documents is a letter dated from the 13th century, discovered in the archives of a French abbey demolished during the Revolution. The author, identified only as Friar S., writes to an unknown recipient about the library that has no door but many keys. He describes cataloging rituals performed in absolute silence, where participants communicated only through gestures. He mentions that certain books were copied 3 times: one version for the official archives, a complete version for the lower repository, and a coded version for circulation among those who see. The letter ends abruptly with the phrase, "What we protect does not belong to us. It belongs to the time to come when fear no longer governs faith." Another piece of evidence comes from a 15th century cardinal's diary, where he describes a disturbing nocturnal encounter. Lost in the Vatican corridors after a meeting that stretched late into the night, he follows the sound of Gregorian chants and discovers a chapel he doesn't recognize. Inside, 7 hooded figures are holding what appears to be a vigil, but the texts they are reading are not from the conventional psalters. When they notice his presence, they abruptly stop and exit through a side passage that the cardinal is later unable to locate. The next day, when he mentions the incident to an older colleague, he receives only a meaningful look and the advice, "Certain mysteries serve the Church better by remaining mysteries. What you saw, you did not see." The architecture of the Vatican itself bears clues to the Vatican's secret brotherhood. Modern structural studies have revealed intriguing inconsistencies: interior spaces that do not correspond to the external dimensions of certain buildings, creating ghost rooms of several cubic meters that do not appear on official plans, staircases that end in solid walls but whose proportions suggest that they originally continued, ventilation systems that seem to serve areas that officially do not exist. Engineers speculate about unmapped catacombs, forgotten sanctuaries, or simply construction errors accumulated over centuries. But the errors follow all too convenient patterns, always creating perfect hiding places for secret libraries. Relics also tell parallel stories. The Vatican possesses one of the world's largest collections of Christian relics, meticulously cataloged and authenticated. But persistent rumors exist of a black collection, sacred objects whose authenticity is doubtful, whose provenance is problematic, or whose spiritual power is considered too dangerous for display. Fragments of apocryphal gospels written on parchment from the 1st century, amulets of Gnostic Christians, prophetic texts that predicted schisms in the church, artifacts from syncretic cults that mixed Christianity with pagan traditions. If such objects exist, who would guard them if not those dedicated to preserving the inconvenient? Comment on what your instinct tells you. Is it faith, or is it fear? The deepest answers often come from silence. Oral testimonies have also survived, discreetly passed down through generations of families connected to the Vatican. One such story tells of a young seminarian in the 19th century who, lost at night, found a candlelit library where elderly monks devoutly copied texts. Fascinated, he observed for hours. One of the monks finally approached and, without saying a word, showed him a manuscript. It was a gospel with passages the seminarian had never seen in the official Bible. The monk closed the book, pointed to the exit, and the young man understood. He had been graced with a vision, but not with permission to speak. He became a priest, served for decades, and only on his deathbed did he murmur the story to a nephew, making him swear never to investigate, only to remember. Financial records present their own anomalies. Analyses of Vatican accounting documents spanning centuries show regular expenses classified into vague categories: maintenance of auxiliary structures, acquisition of materials for special preservation, stipend for secondary archiving personnel. These are never enormous sums, always discreet, easy to ignore. But their consistency across centuries, even during periods of financial crisis when everything else was cut, suggests they funded something considered essential by successive papal administrations. Something that couldn't be openly named, but neither could it be abandoned. If truth touches the invisible, leave a sign of light. A silent but powerful gesture. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood left traces not only in objects and documents, but in the very institutional culture of the Church. The practice of creating reserved archives, accessible only to researchers with special permissions, echoes the mentality of selective preservation. The tradition of translating and preserving even heretical texts for the purpose of refutation keeps alive the logic that knowing error is necessary to defend truth. The acceptance that certain documents must remain sealed for decades or centuries reflects the understanding that not all truth is beneficial at all times. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the Brotherhood existed, but whether it still exists. In an age of digitalization, transparency, and constant public scrutiny, would it be possible to maintain a secret order within the Vatican? Or has modernity finally dissolved what centuries of history had consolidated? Some observers note that, ironically, the digital age may have facilitated secrecy. Information can be hidden on encrypted servers more easily than on physical scrolls, and an organization that survived from the medieval period to the modern era has certainly learned to adapt. Perhaps the shadow monks now use tablets instead of candles, but continue their essential vocation, guarding what the official faith is not yet ready to confront. Belonging to the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood meant inhabiting a permanent contradiction. The monks lived within an institution that represented dogmatic certainty, but dedicated their lives to preserving doubts, alternatives, and complexities that this certainty needed to deny. They were men of profound faith serving the Church through acts that, if revealed, could be interpreted as subversion. This paradox generated intense spiritual tensions that no ritual or oath could completely dissolve. Each member needed, individually and continuously, to reconcile their secret vocation with their public identity as a servant of the Holy See. The conflicts weren't just internal. Throughout the centuries, there were times when factions within the Vatican discovered evidence of the Brotherhood and demanded its dissolution. During the Inquisition, when orthodoxy was enforced with brutal rigor, possessing heretical texts, even for historical preservation, was grounds for investigation. The Brotherhood needed to become even more invisible, developing elaborate concealment techniques. Members learned to operate as isolated cells, each knowing only their immediate contacts. They developed coded languages that resembled mundane administrative correspondence. Some even voluntarily submitted to inquisitorial interrogations, confessing minor sins to divert attention from their true activity. The deepest struggle, however, was philosophical and theological. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood constantly grappled with the question, does preserving everything serve truth or confusion? If a Gnostic text presents Jesus saying something radically different from the canonical Gospels, is preserving that text historical honesty, or a betrayal of the tradition that shaped the faith of millions? If a medieval prophecy suggests that the Church will one day become completely corrupt, is preserving it prudence or heretical pessimism? Each member had to decide, again and again, whether their vocation was a sacred mission or intellectual pride disguised as historical zeal. Some members of the Brotherhood throughout the centuries broke under the weight of these contradictions. There are accounts of monks who, after decades of keeping secrets, experienced a crisis of conscience and attempted to reveal everything. One of them, in the 16th century, is said to have tried to send copies of forbidden texts to Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great humanist, believing that the Protestant Reformation had created a moment in which the complete truth could finally emerge. He was intercepted by other members of the Brotherhood and confined to a life of silent penance in a remote monastery. Another, in the 18th century, is said to have planned to burn the secret archives, arguing that keeping the memory of heresies alive was cooperating with the devil. He was convinced not to do so only by a pragmatic argument. If the archives were destroyed, the Church would lose the ability to refute those same heresies should they resurface. Those who remain until now bear the weight of revelation. Which side of the veil would you choose? Belief or forgetfulness? The relationship between knowledge and faith has always been complex in Christianity. Paul of Tarsus warned against the gnosis that puffs up, preferring the love that builds up. Tertullian rhetorically asked, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" questioning the very pursuit of philosophical knowledge in matters of faith. But other church fathers, such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, integrated reason and revelation, believing that truth cannot contradict truth. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood inherited this tension without resolving it, merely managing it generation after generation, trusting that the Spirit worked through time in mysterious ways. There were times when the Church itself almost voluntarily opened its secret archives. At the Second Vatican Council during the 1960s, when the Church was modernizing and engaging with the contemporary world, some progressive theologians suggested that it was time to make public the apocryphal texts and controversial historical documents kept for centuries. They argued that mature faith could withstand historical complexity, that intellectual honesty would strengthen the Church rather than weaken it. The proposal was debated in private sessions and ultimately rejected, not out of bad faith but out of pastoral prudence. Church leaders concluded that, while theologians could deal with ambiguity, the faith of the simple could be unnecessarily shaken. The Brotherhood, informed of the decision, continued its mission with a renewed sense of purpose. The conflict between light and shadow, between revelation and concealment, is not unique to the Catholic Church. It is archetypal of any institution that simultaneously seeks truth and stability. Every tradition faces dilemmas between ideological purity and historical complexity, between edifying narratives and uncomfortable realities. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood represents a particular solution to this universal dilemma, not denying complexity, but temporarily isolating it, trusting that the future will know what to do with it. It is a gamble on providence through preservation. Subscribe and walk with us. Each new video is a key, and each key unlocks another seal. The members of the Brotherhood themselves lived this tension existentially. They attended the same masses as other Catholics, recited the same creeds, obeyed the same superiors, but they carried within themselves a parallel knowledge that gave new meaning to every word spoken publicly. When they prayed, "I believe in the Holy Catholic Church," they knew of all the historical divisions that this declaration of unity concealed. When they venerated saints, they knew of the passionate debates about their canonizations. When they kissed relics, they were aware of the doubts about authenticity that surrounded many of them. They were not cynical. They still believed deeply, but their faith was more complex, more aware of its own human foundations. Some contemporary theologians, speculating on the possible existence of the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood, argue that its function was essentially eschatological, focused on the end times. They preserved controversial texts not for present use, but for a future moment of final judgment or total renewal of the Church. In this interpretation, the shadow monks were like Noah building the ark. They preserved seeds of theological diversity for replanting after some future flood that would wash away the current structures. It was a form of paradoxical hope, expecting the survival of complete truth through the very institution that partially censored it. The invisible struggle continues in every generation of Christians who face the tension between received tradition and discovered truth, between institutional loyalty and intellectual honesty, between inherited faith and self-understanding. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood does not resolve this tension. It merely embodies it in a particularly dramatic way. And perhaps its greatest lesson is not about the Church but about human nature. The capacity to live simultaneously in multiple truths, to serve faithfully while deeply questioning, to love an institution without blind idealization. These monks in the shadows, if they existed or exist, are mirrors of the contradictions we all carry. There are rituals that are not found in any missal, ceremonies that do not echo in the illuminated naves of basilicas, but whisper in chambers where the air seems denser than elsewhere. The shadow monks, according to the fragments that have survived the silence, developed their own liturgies, spiritual practices that consecrated not the public revelation of divine truth but its secret preservation. These rituals were neither blasphemous nor heretical. Rather, they were sacraments of archiving, masses of conscious forgetting, vigils of subterranean memory. The most important ritual of the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood was called, according to a fragmentary manuscript, the Vigil of Secrets. It took place once a year, on a date that varied according to complex liturgical calendars, never on days of great festivity, always at times of transition, between seasons, between lunar phases, between pontificates. The participants fasted for 3 days before the ceremony, not as penance for sin, but as a purification of the mind to receive the weight of hidden knowledge. On the designated day, at nightfall, the members gathered in the deepest chamber of their underground sanctuary. The chamber was austere, bare stone walls without frescoes or ornamentation, only a stone table in the center, serving as an altar. Beeswax candles, never oil, always wax, symbolizing patient work and slow transformation, were arranged in a circle. The members entered barefoot in simple tunics without insignia, for in that ceremony they did not represent external ecclesiastical hierarchies, but only their shared vocation as guardians. The silence was absolute, not by imposed rule, but out of natural reverence for what they were about to accomplish. The ritual began with a symbolic gesture. Each member brought an object representing something they had preserved during the year. It could be a newly copied manuscript, a fragment of restored parchment, a translation of an ancient text, or simply a catalog card from a recently archived document. They placed these objects on the stone altar, creating an irregular pile of testimonies to the invisible work done. Then, the oldest member, not necessarily the oldest in years, but the one who had served the longest, lit the first candle using flint and stone, an archaic method symbolizing the antiquity of their mission. What followed was what the fragments call the Litany of the Forgotten. It wasn't exactly a prayer, but a memorial recitation. Each member, in turn, briefly mentioned some text, teaching, or tradition that the Brotherhood had preserved against oblivion. They didn't read the texts themselves. They only named their existence. The Gospel of Mary, where the disciple teaches the apostles. Hildegard's prophecy about the 7 crises of the Church. The letters of Pope Honorius, who was condemned for heresy by his successors. Origen's treatise on the universal restoration of all souls. Each mention was received in silence, without comment, only recognition that it continued to exist thanks to the work of the Secret Brotherhood of the Vatican. The central part of the ritual was more contemplative. Candles burned, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The members sat in a circle and entered into deep meditation. They prayed not for the living nor for the dead, but for something more abstract, for the very act of preservation, for the sanctity of archiving, for the dignity of what was rejected but not annihilated. They meditated on the responsibility of carrying knowledge they could not use, on the humility of serving future generations who might never know of their existence. It was a wordless prayer, an offering without a public altar, a mass celebrated only before the eternal eye that sees all, including what humans choose to hide from one another. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this rite. The simple act of seeing is participating. After hours of meditative silence came what the fragments call the renewal of the oath. Each member, remaining seated but extending their hands over the objects on the altar, internally renewed their commitment. There were no prescribed words. Each one formulated their own silent oath. But the essence was always threefold. First, to preserve without revealing. Second, to know without judging. Third, to serve the future through the present. The oath was not witnessed by human authority, only by their own conscience and by that invisible presence which they believed blessed their paradoxical work. The ritual ended with a gesture of dispersal. Each member retrieved the object they had brought and returned to their duties. There were no embraces, farewell words, or gestures of communion. They simply left one by one, carrying their candles, until the chamber was once again dark. The empty stone altar became just stone again. The space became just space again. But something intangible had been renewed. The pact between these men and the mission that transcended their individual lives. The Secret Brotherhood of the Vatican did not exist in visible structures, but in this spiritual bond, reaffirmed annually in the darkness. Other minor rituals punctuated the Brotherhood's calendar. When a new text was acquired for the secret repository, a brief reception ceremony was held. The document was placed on a clean surface, covered with a dark cloth, and a candle was lit beside it overnight. This was not worship of the object, but recognition of its importance. Each manuscript bore witness to a human spiritual journey, even if that journey had been officially condemned. In the morning, the text was catalogued and stored, but that nightly vigil transformed the administrative act of archiving into a sacramental act of custody. When a member of the Brotherhood passed away, there was a unique rite of passage. Unlike the public funerals of clergymen, which were elaborate ceremonies with solemn masses, the death of a shadow monk was marked only by his fellow members of the order. They would gather briefly in their secret sanctuary, light 7 candles, a symbolic number of completeness, and remain silent for 7 minutes. Then, each remaining member would mentally assume responsibility for a portion of the knowledge the deceased held, ensuring that nothing would be lost in death. There were no epitaphs, monuments, or even written records of the deaths, only the silent continuation of the work. Leave your mark in the comments. This is how silence becomes community. The sensory dimension of these rituals was carefully calibrated. The smell of burning beeswax, the cold touch of the stone under bare feet, the damp weight of the underground air, the almost inaudible rustling of slowly moving robes, the particular quality of the darkness interrupted only by candle flames. All this created an experience that deeply marked the body's memory. Members could forget words and concepts, but they never forgot the sensation of those chambers, of those vigils. The ritual imprinted itself not only on the mind but on the body, guaranteeing loyalty that transcended reasoning. There are unconfirmed reports that certain Brotherhood rituals included elements bordering on the mystical in the deepest sense. During prolonged meditations in the underground chambers, some members are said to have experienced visions, not induced hallucinations, but contemplative states where they felt connected to all those who, throughout history, had chosen to preserve inconvenient truth. They saw themselves as links in a chain that spanned millennia, scribes who hid texts during persecutions, copyist monks who preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages, librarians who saved books from bonfires. The Secret Brotherhood of the Vatican was just one particular manifestation of this universal vocation to guard memory against oblivion. The rituals also served an essential psychological function. They transformed what might seem like transgression into a sacred calling. Without these rituals, members could easily feel like mere conspirators, violators of ecclesiastical rules. But through the secret liturgy, they reinterpreted their actions as spiritual service. The ritual constructed a religious framework where secrecy was not shame but responsibility, where concealment was not lying but protecting, where serving in the shadows was not cowardice but radical humility. It was performative theology, ritualistically doing what could not be defended discursively. The Brotherhood's ritual tradition apparently evolved over the centuries. Fragmentary records suggest that in the early centuries it was simpler, just basic oaths and preservation practices. Over time, as the order became institutionalized and faced existential crises, the rituals became more elaborate, incorporating elements from various monastic traditions. There were Benedictine influences in the emphasis on silence, Franciscan echoes in material simplicity, Dominican traces in the valuing of knowledge and something Carthusian in the extreme isolation. The Secret Vatican Brotherhood synthesized the best of Catholic monastic spiritualities, but directed everything toward a single purpose: the preservation of the forgotten. If these rituals still occur today, they would naturally have adapted, perhaps no longer in candlelit chambers, but in locked rooms with encrypted digital access, perhaps no longer in robes and bare feet, but with the same inner intention clothed in contemporary attire, perhaps no longer handling physical scrolls but backing up digital files performed with the same reverence. The form changes, the essence may remain. Every truly living tradition finds ways of reincarnation that preserve its spirit while updating its expression. The shadow monks, if they still exist, have certainly mastered this art through the centuries. At the end of this journey through sacred shadows, we arrive at the fundamental paradox. The more that is revealed about the Vatican's secret brotherhood, the deeper the mystery becomes. Each fragment of evidence opens new questions. Each testimony leads to denser silences. It is as if the very nature of the brotherhood resists complete clarification, not through active conspiracy, but because its essence is precisely to inhabit the boundaries between knowing and not knowing, between revealing and concealing, between memory and forgetting. What did we actually discover? That over the centuries within the institution that presented itself as the guardian of Christian orthodoxy, there operated, and perhaps still operates, a group dedicated to preserving precisely what that orthodoxy needed to exclude in order to remain coherent. That the Church, that seemingly monolithic structure of dogmatic certainties, contained within its own core a conscious contradiction. Men who simultaneously affirmed the creeds and protected what questioned them. That faith and doubt, tradition and diversity, official revelation and guarded secrets were not absolute opposites, but polarities maintained in creative tension through this hidden order. The Vatican's secret brotherhood confronts us with uncomfortable truths about religious institutions in general. Every tradition, to consolidate itself, needs simplification. It needs to choose certain texts and reject others, canonize certain interpretations and condemn alternatives, celebrate certain saints and forget problematic figures. This is not necessarily bad faith. It is the inevitable process of identity construction. But something is lost in this process. And the fundamental ethical question is, what do we do with what has been rejected? Do we destroy it completely, as if it never existed? Or do we secretly preserve it, recognizing that future truth may require present complexity? The shadow monks chose the middle path, neither destruction nor revelation, but silent stewardship. This path has its own dignity. It acknowledges that not all truth is useful at all times, that not all complexity strengthens nascent faith, that not all knowledge builds up immature community. But it also rejects the arrogance of presuming that the present has the right to definitively determine what the future may know. It is humility before history, admitting that this generation does not possess final wisdom, that future generations may be ready for what would disturb today. The journey continues. Subscribe and follow along. Each new episode is a flame lit in the darkness. If the Brotherhood existed and no longer exists, its dissolution may have occurred in several ways. Perhaps with the partial opening of the Vatican secret archives in the 20th century, when many previously restricted documents became accessible to researchers, the Brotherhood's function lost its meaning. Perhaps modern secularization, which drastically reduced the Church's power over consciences, made it unnecessary to protect the faithful from historical complexity. People no longer care as much. Perhaps there simply weren't any more young people willing to embrace such a peculiar and solitary vocation. But if it still exists, it has radically transformed. Contemporary challenges to faith are different from medieval ones. Today, the problem is not an excess of dogmatic certainty, but relativistic fragmentation. It is not oppressive authority, but the absence of recognized authority. In this context, a contemporary brotherhood might have an inverted function, not to preserve what questions orthodoxy, but to safeguard orthodoxy itself against total dilution. Or perhaps its mission has expanded, to preserve not only heterodox Christian texts, but the spiritual wisdom of all traditions that modernity threatens to erase. The shadow monks as archivists of the very possibility of sacredness in a secularized world. The most profound revelation may be this: the Vatican's secret brotherhood is not so much about the Catholic Church specifically, but about universal tension within every living tradition. Judaism has its own dialectic between written and oral Torah, between codified law and ongoing interpretation. Islam constantly debates between closing and reopening the doors of ijtihad, of independent interpretation. Buddhism navigates between preserving original teachings and cultural adaptations. Every religion faces the question: how to maintain identity without fossilizing, how to evolve without losing essence, how to be faithful to the past while serving the present. Write in the comments what the silence told you today. Sometimes, that's where the truth manifests itself. The secret the Brotherhood kept may be less important than the act of keeping it itself, less about the specific contents of apocryphal gospels or heterodox prophecies, and more about recognizing that mystery is constitutive of authentic faith, that absolute certainty is disguised idolatry, that not knowing completely is not weakness, but honesty, that God, if he exists, is necessarily greater than our theologies, more complex than our creeds, more paradoxical than our orthodoxies. Protecting texts that reveal this complexity is protecting divine transcendence itself against human domestication. Some argue that religious institutions should never have secrets, that total transparency is an ethical requirement in any organization that claims moral authority. This argument has weight, but there is an equally powerful counter-argument that genuine wisdom has always included esoteric dimensions, gradual teachings, truths that require preparation. Plato distinguished between exotericism, public teaching, and esotericism, internal teaching. Jesus spoke in parables to the crowds, but explained them privately to his disciples. Traditions of mystery have always existed. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood may simply be a Catholic version of this universal principle. Not everything can be said to everyone at all times. The final judgment on the Brotherhood depends on perspective. For defenders of rigid orthodoxy, they were traitors who kept alive heresies that should have been eradicated. For anti-clerical critics, they were accomplices who helped the Church hide inconvenient truths. For historians, they are a fascinating enigma that reveals rarely admitted institutional complexities. For mystics, they are a model of humble service to a truth greater than any institution. Each judgment reveals more about the judge than about those judged. Perhaps the final lesson is about ourselves. Each of us in our lives holds truths that we don't fully express, knowledge that we keep because the moment isn't right, doubts that we feel but don't share out of respect for others' faith, complexities that we perceive but simplify in communication. In this sense, we are all members of our own inner secret brotherhood, preserving in the shadows of individual consciousness what the public persona needs to conceal. The shadow monks have merely collectivized and ritualized what we do privately, inhabiting the tension between what we know and what we say. The Vatican's Secret Brotherhood, whether or not it exists as a concrete historical organization, certainly exists as a spiritual archetype. It represents the human need to preserve memory against oblivion, to protect complexity against oversimplification, to keep alive the possibility of different futures by honoring rejected pasts. This archetype manifests itself in every librarian who saves banned books, every historian who studies defeated perspectives, every person who refuses to forget what society has decided not to remember. If there were a final message from the shadow monks for us, perhaps it would be this: do not fear the mystery, do not demand premature clarity. Do not confuse uncertainty with infidelity. Truth is too vast to be contained within any single system. God, or the sacred or ultimate reality, is too profound to be exhausted by any single tradition. And precisely because this is true, all traditions contain fragments of light that, together, reflect something greater than any one of them in isolation. Preserving these fragments, even the uncomfortable and contradictory ones, is not frivolous relativism. It is reverence for the immensity of that which we seek to understand. The history of the Vatican's Secret Brotherhood, factual, legendary, or symbolic, invites us to a more mature faith, a faith that can endure doubt, because it does not confuse doubt with disbelief, a faith that can embrace complexity, because it does not confuse simplicity with truth, a faith that can honor institutions without idolizing them, that can recognize authority without relinquishing conscience, that can belong to traditions without being imprisoned by them. This is the faith that the shadow monks, paradoxically through their secrecy, protected so that future generations could breathe freely within the temples their ancestors built. The veil is not fully lifted. The mystery remains. And perhaps that is exactly how it should be. Because religion without mystery is not faith. It is ideology. An institution without contradiction is not human. It is fiction. History without complexity is not memory. It is propaganda. The Secret Brotherhood of the Vatican, in the shadows where it dwelt, guarded something more precious than documents. It guarded the very possibility of truth being greater than our certainties, of God being vaster than our theologies, of faith being an endless journey and not a destination reached. We have walked together this far through unseen corridors, forgotten chambers, and silent rituals. We have discovered that the shadows of faith are not necessarily darkness but twilight, where eyes can adapt to see what excessive light blinds. And now, at the end of this journey, each returns to their own life carrying something of this knowledge. What will they do with it? Will they keep it in reverent silence as the monks did? Will they share it with those who are ready? Or will they simply allow it to subtly transform their understanding of faith, institution, and truth? The mystery continues. New chapters await. Other secret orders inhabit other corners of history. Other secrets whisper in other crypts. The journey through the hidden Vatican is only beginning. And you, who have remained until now, who have crossed the veil with contemplative attention, are now part of this invisible circle of seekers, not seekers of secrets for the pleasure of conspiracy, but seekers of a deeper understanding of how the sacred and the human intertwine in institutions that shape the faith of billions. In the next episode, we'll descend even deeper into the Vatican's underground. We'll explore the forbidden rituals performed in the catacombs, where profane masses were allegedly celebrated among the tombs of martyrs, where the sacred and the profane touch in even more disturbing ways, where the boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy completely dissolve. Prepare yourself. What we've discovered about the Brotherhood is only the first veil lifted. There are 7 veils in total, and each one reveals denser shadows, older mysteries, more challenging truths. Until we meet again in the sacred shadows.